The Hart household seemed like the picture of suburban peace. Neighbors often saw Emily Hart tending her rose garden in the front yard, dressed neatly even when pulling weeds, her dark hair pinned in place, her hands smelling faintly of lavender soap. She baked cookies for the church fundraiser, volunteered for school events, and never raised her voice in public. To everyone, she was the embodiment of the ideal wife and mother, devoted to her husband Daniel and their 2 children, devoted to her Catholic faith, and a constant presence at Sunday Mass. But behind the polished surfaces of her home and her carefully practiced smile, Emily carried a weight she could tell no one. Daniel, her husband of 14 years, was reliable but distant, working long hours as an accountant. Their marriage was steady, not passionate, and though she loved her children fiercely, Emily often found herself lying awake at night, her heart pounding with the emptiness of unspoken longings. Inside their quiet home, the air grew cold with routine. Emily's life was predictable, restrained, and beneath the layers of domestic perfection, a storm had begun to gather. It was in the pews of St. Augustine's Church, beneath the watchful eyes of the crucifix, that Emily's carefully guarded desires would one day find both comfort and danger. Father Michael Donnelly was a man both respected and quietly admired by the parish. In his early 40s, with kind eyes that seemed to look through people instead of at them, he carried a calm presence in every room. His sermons held a warmth that eased the troubled, and his words often lingered long after he stepped down from the pulpit. To the congregation, he was a shepherd of souls, young, devoted, and charismatic in a way that unsettled those who believed priests should be distant and untouchable. For Emily, the connection began innocently enough. One summer afternoon, after a particularly heated argument with Daniel about money, she ducked into St. Augustine's to collect her nerves. Father Michael noticed her trembling hands as she lit a candle and approached her gently. "Peace is hard to find when the heart is troubled," he said softly. "Would you like to talk?" Something in his tone was disarming. Emily found herself nodding, following him into the small confessional room where shadows softened the edges of truth. She began with the safe stuff: her exhaustion, her loneliness, her feeling of invisibility inside her marriage. But when the silence stretched too long, her words spilled faster, heavier, revealing cracks she never dared share before. Michael listened intently, his hands folded beneath his chin. He did not interrupt. He did not judge. At the end, he offered comfort rather than the usual rebuke of sin. "You are not beyond God's love, Emily," he told her, his voice steady yet almost tender. "Even in loneliness, you are seen." That night, Emily replayed his voice in her head like a hymn. The kindness, the sincerity, it filled something that had been hollow for years. She felt understood in a way Daniel no longer seemed capable of providing. Weeks turned into months, and their conversations deepened. Sometimes he walked her to her car after evening confessions. Sometimes she stayed behind to help tidy the parish after service, lingering too long in his company. Their laughter grew freer, her smiles brighter, but always under the strict veil of secrecy. Father Michael was bound by vows of chastity, an oath Emily herself once respected deeply. Yet, the more she found comfort in his presence, the more dangerous her emotions became. What began as a harmless refuge, a priest comforting a troubled wife, was quietly slipping beyond the boundaries of faith and morality. The line had yet to be crossed, but both could already feel its pull like a dark current beneath calm waters. It happened on a rainy evening in October. The church was nearly empty after choir practice, the sound of thunder rolling faintly beyond the stained glass windows. Emily lingered, pretending to straighten him books, though in truth she was waiting for him. Father Michael found her in the aisle, her hair damp from the mist outside, her expression somewhere between nervous anticipation and guilt. He should have turned away, should have reminded her of the boundaries between them. But instead, he stepped closer. "Emily," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying in the cavernous church. "People might begin to wonder if you're always the last one here." She gave a faint, nervous smile. "Let them wonder. For the first time in years, I feel alive." That confession hung heavily between them, more dangerous than anything she had uttered in the confessional. Michael's chest tightened, torn between duty and desire, between his vow to God and the aching connection that had grown between them. When Emily's hand trembled, brushing against his sleeve, it was as if something inside both of them broke. His fingers closed over hers, not in a priest's gesture of reassurance, but in the grip of a man who had been denying himself for too long. They said nothing as their eyes locked, as the candlelight flickered against their faces. A kiss should never have happened beneath the shadow of the crucifix, and yet it did, brief, trembling, but deep enough to unravel every line that faith had drawn for them. What followed in the weeks ahead was deliberate evidence of their shared fall. Meetings arranged under false pretenses, hurried embraces in dim parking lots, whispered secrets over the phone at midnight. Emily's heart raced with exhilaration, the thrill of forbidden love washing away years of quiet despair. Father Michael, meanwhile, preached to his congregation on Sundays with a fractured soul, torn between the sanctity of his words and the unholy passion he was living in private. But when he looked at Emily, all his guilt drowned in the heat of desire. The affair was now real. Every secret rendezvous tightened the knot of deception, each kiss pulling them further away from absolution and closer toward damnation. And though neither wanted to admit it, deep down, they both knew. Someone would eventually notice. With the line crossed, Emily and Father Michael stepped fully into a hidden world. Every moment together had to be carefully orchestrated, every word rehearsed in case curious ears overheard. Emily told Daniel she was volunteering more at the parish, sometimes staying late to arrange food drives or choir schedules. He accepted the excuses at first, distracted by work and accounting deadlines. To the children, she was simply at church again. Nothing unusual for their devout mother. But the details began to show cracks. Late-night phone calls that Emily took in the kitchen after everyone was asleep, her voice low and strained. Mysterious errands that left her returning home with a flushed face. Father Michael, once the priest admired for his composure, now lived with two faces. In the pulpit, he spoke of purity, forgiveness, and the strength to resist temptation. But in dimly lit motel rooms on the outskirts of town, with drawn curtains and the smell of stale perfume, he held Emily like a man drowning, clinging to the very sin he condemned. Fear hovered over them both, making every meeting a risk. A neighbor spotting her car too far from home. A parishioner noticing the way Michael's gaze lingered on her at Mass. The possibility of Daniel asking one too many questions. Still, they fed on the danger. The secrecy was intoxicating, sharpening the thrill of every touch, every whispered promise. Their love was a spark hidden under dry leaves. One stray glance, one wrong word, and the fire could spread beyond control. But under Emily's stolen moments of joy, guilt gnawed at her. She avoided Daniel's eyes at dinner, avoided sitting too close in bed, afraid he might somehow smell the truth on her skin. He was not a cruel man, but he was observant, and she knew his suspicions had begun to stir. And for Father Michael, the weight became greater each Sunday, when the congregation knelt before him and trusted his absolution. Behind every prayer was a lie he could no longer contain, a double life threatening to unravel with a single slip. Unbeknownst to them, the walls of secrecy were already thinning. The shadows they hid within would not hold forever. Daniel Hart was not a man given to wild emotions. Numbers and routines shaped his life, and for years he had relied on predictability. The steady sound of his calculator, the same commute, the comfort of knowing his wife and children waited at home every evening. But lately, something gnawed at him. Emily was slipping away piece by piece. It began subtly. She dressed differently, not extravagantly, but with an unfamiliar care, as if she were preparing to be seen by someone other than him. Conversations at dinner grew shorter, her mind distant, her phone always within reach. Nights once spent side by side in bed turned into her lingering in the kitchen long after the lights should have gone out. At first, Daniel told himself it was stress. Everyone struggled. Yet when he leaned over one night to kiss her cheek, she stiffened, and though she whispered, "I'm just tired," her eyes darted away. That moment froze in his mind like a splinter. He began to watch. He noticed how often she mentioned church events, volunteer meetings, choir practices, new programs Father Michael needed help with. Too often. And her returns from these supposed meetings came later. Her hair tousled in ways that didn't match the neatness he remembered. Daniel's suspicion turned to vigilance. He checked her car's fuel gauge when she came home, memorized the miles on the odometer, glanced at her phone when she left it unattended. Each small clue confirmed what he dreaded. Something was terribly wrong. One evening, his gut told him to follow her. Emily kissed the children goodnight, slipped on a light coat, and told Daniel she was heading to the parish hall to prepare for Sunday. He waited a few minutes after she left, then grabbed his keys. Rain slicked the roads as he trailed her at a distance, keeping his headlights dim. Instead of turning toward the church, Emily merged onto the highway, driving out toward the next town. Daniel's jaw tightened as he followed, every second thickening the punch of betrayal in his gut. Finally, she pulled into the lot of a cheap roadside motel, its neon sign buzzing in the rain. Daniel parked at the edge of the lot, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles bleached white. From the shadows, he watched his wife step out of the car, her pace quick and purposeful. Moments later, a familiar figure appeared at the motel entrance. Father Michael. Daniel felt his chest collapse. The priest shook his wife's hand first, a theatrical gesture of caution, but then leaned close, far too close, guiding her inside. The truth no longer needed confirmation. His wife's secrecy, the priest's late-night absence. It all snapped together like the last piece of a puzzle. Rage boiled inside him, hot and corrosive, but he forced himself still. He needed to think. He needed to know everything before he acted. So Daniel sat in that car, the rain hammering on the windshield, his eyes fixed on the motel door. Each minute that ticked by, each shadow that slid across the curtain of the rented room, pulled him deeper into a darkness he had never known within himself. And when Emily finally emerged hours later, trying to look casual, Daniel already knew. The confrontation was coming. It was no longer a question of if, but when. Daniel did not confront them that night at the motel. He drove home ahead of Emily, returned to his side of the bed, and feigned sleep. But his mind was a storm, circling the same unforgiving truth. His wife had betrayed him, and the man she had chosen was the very priest who stood each week before the altar and looked into Daniel's eyes. Days passed in silence, Daniel watching more than speaking. Emily grew nervous under his gaze, sensing the space between them thickening like glass about to shatter. She made small excuses, extra meetings, late dinners, but her husband's silence said more than any accusation. The breaking point came on a Friday night. Rain lashed against the windows, the children asleep upstairs. Emily returned late again, her hair damp, her cheeks glowing from more than the weather. She entered expecting routine, but instead found Daniel waiting in the living room, the lamp casting hard shadows across his gaunt, sleepless face. "Where were you?" His voice was calm, too calm. "At the church," Emily replied instantly. The lie came rehearsed, but her eyes betrayed her. Darting, evasive. Daniel leaned forward. "I followed you once. To the motel." The color drained from her face. For a moment, neither spoke, only the sound of rain hammering against the glass. Then Emily sank into a chair, covering her mouth, as tears welled in her eyes. "It's not what you think," she began, but Daniel cut her off, his voice cracking now from swallowed rage. "It is exactly what I think. You and him, the priest." At the mention of Father Michael, Emily's silence confirmed everything. Later that weekend, Daniel acted on his fury. He waited, knowing Emily and Father Michael sometimes met in the rectory after evening service. Past midnight, when most of the parish was dark, Daniel stormed inside. The confrontation exploded in the narrow office lit by a single lamp. Emily was already there with Michael, their voices hushed, the intimacy between them undeniable. When Daniel's heavy footsteps echoed in the corridor, both froze as if judgment itself had arrived. "You hypocrite!" Daniel's voice thundered, his arms trembling. He pointed at Michael. "You God's servant. Stealing my wife under God's roof. Michael raised his hands in a gesture of peace, but his eyes flickered with fear. Daniel, listen to me. No! Daniel lunged forward, fury boiling into violence. Shoves turned to blows, the furniture crashing around them. Emily screamed, trying to pull them apart, but the years of suppressed anger in Daniel unleashed like an avalanche. Father Michael fought back, equally desperate, his collar torn, his face twisted with guilt and rage. The scuffle tipped dangerously close to tragedy, every second threatening to push one over the edge. In that midnight office, faith crumbled, vows shattered, and blood, unseen for centuries inside St. Augustine's holy walls, spilled across the floor. The room reeked of sweat, blood, and overturned incense. Daniel lay crumpled on the floor, his chest no longer rising, his eyes half open as though staring straight through them both. The fight had ended not with words but with a sickening finality. One strike too many, one fall too hard against the corner of the desk. Emily's trembling hands pressed against her mouth, muffling a scream. She knelt beside her husband, calling his name as if sheer desperation could drag him back. But his body was heavy, still unmoving. Father Michael staggered backwards, his collar torn, blood smearing his knuckles. His breath came in ragged bursts, his face drained of color. He stared at the body in disbelief, whispering over and over like a broken prayer, "Oh God, what have I done? What have I done?" Emily turned to him, her tears streaking down her cheeks. We can't call the police," she stammered. "They'll take everything from us, the children, your parish, everything." Michael's eyes burned, torn between duty and terror. By every law of the church, by every law of man, he should have gone straight to confession, to the authorities, bearing his sin for judgment. But Emily's voice was pleading, desperate, and full of the same need that had pulled him to cross his vows in the first place. "They'll say it was murder," Emily whispered, clutching his arm. "They won't understand. We'll both lose everything. Please, Michael, please." The priest's body shook with the weight of temptation. Killing a man, her husband, was a sin beyond absolution. Yet looking at Emily, broken and wild-eyed, he felt trapped in his own cage of choices. Finally, his voice came low, hoarse, and resigned. "Then we have to hide it." The words hung heavy, darker than any vow he had ever spoken. Together, they worked through trembling hands and frantic whispers. They cleaned the blood as best they could, scrubbing the wood, stacking toppled books, trying to erase what could never truly vanish. They wrapped Daniel in a church cloth, his blood staining the sacred linen like an unholy mockery. Past midnight, under the cover of driving rain, they carried him to Michael's car. Every shadow seemed to lunge at them, every creak of the old church threatening to cry out their guilt. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by Emily's muffled sobs. They drove toward the woods at the edge of town, where the earth softened under the storm. With shaking hands and mud caked to their skin, they buried Daniel beneath twisted roots and dripping branches, the priest whispering prayers through trembling lips as though scraps of scripture could sanctify a crime. When the last of the soil was patted down, both stood in silence, knowing an unholy covenant bound them now. Their affair had once been about longing, desire, escape. But tonight, it had transformed into something far darker. A secret grave, a shared guilt, and a pact sealed not in love, but in blood. In the days after Daniel's disappearance, the Hart household was shrouded in an uneasy quiet. Emily forced herself into the routines of normalcy, packing lunches, smiling at her children, attending Sunday service. But everything felt brittle, rehearsed. When neighbors asked casually if Daniel was away on business, she gave carefully constructed answers, forcing a soft laugh that barely hid the tremor in her voice. But at night, when the house was still and the shadows stretched long across her bedroom walls, Emily's mask slipped. She would stare at Daniel's empty side of the bed, her hands trembling. The memory of his lifeless eyes burned into her mind. Sleep eluded her. The sheets that once smelled of family and security now smelled of lies and soil. Father Michael fared no better. In the pulpit he looked the same, the compassionate priest, robe crisp, voice calm. Yet his sermons faltered, passages about betrayal caught in his throat, his words breaking under the weight of hypocrisy. Parishioners began to notice how pale he looked, how his hands sometimes shook when lifting the chalice. He began drinking at night, alone in the rectory, trying to drown the image of Daniel's body beneath the earth. But guilt was a shadow that clung tighter with every sip, whispering from the silence of the confessional booth, he once ruled with certainty. Meanwhile, Daniel's absence could no longer be brushed aside. His co-workers reported him missing when he failed to appear for critical audits. Neighbors puzzled over his sudden disappearance without so much as a goodbye. Detective Harris, from the local precinct, began making quiet inquiries. Emily and Michael rehearsed their stories endlessly. He left on a trip, Emily told anyone who asked. Work was overwhelming. He just needed time. Yet even as she spoke, she felt eyes studying her too closely, searching for cracks in her tale. The real cracks were within themselves. Emily avoided Michael in public, terrified someone would notice the tension between them. Their secret meetings grew shorter, filled less with passion and more with whispered arguments over what to do when questions pressed harder. Every creak of Emily's staircase at night made her heart leap. Every knock on the parish door made Michael's stomach tighten. They both lived in constant fear of discovery, bound together not by love anymore, but by the unbearable weight of a body hidden in the rain-soaked woods. The grave they thought was deep enough was not. Not in earth. Not in conscience. Not in time. And already the walls were beginning to close in. Detectives questioned Emily about Daniel's sudden disappearance. Her answers wavered, practiced but unconvincing. At church, Father Michael faltered during sermons, parishioners whispering about his strained demeanor. The walls of secrecy thinned, and suspicions began to multiply. The guilt consumed Father Michael. One evening in the confessional, his voice broke as he hinted at the crime to a parishioner. That whisper traveled quickly, reaching the police. What they buried beneath the soil was clawing its way back into the light. Emily and Michael were arrested, their affair exposed alongside the murder. The courtroom overflowed with scandal, reporters filling every seat. Betrayals, lies, and the gruesome details of Daniel's death painted them not as lovers torn by fate, but as conspirators driven by lust and deception. The verdict was swift, Michael convicted of murder, Emily of conspiracy. Their freedom stolen, their names cursed, they were sentenced to spend their remaining years apart, forever shackled by their choices. What began as a secret romance ended as a tragedy, their love story buried in infamy.